who later married Chrissy Menzies of Thrums. Scott was the last tenant. He bought horses from Bob Faulkner, horse dealer, Millfield, Elgin. He walked them home from Elgin, and the journey did them no good. His last horse was a Schilt called Charlie, along with 2 mules, a white one, which worked, and a brown one, which he could not catch. It just roamed the hills. Mr. and Mrs. John Young. Their daughter married Bill Ettles of the Calaver Hill. Mr. Young was a brother of William Young of Tonbreck. Then there was Captain Watson, who stayed and farmed at the Ardagh. There was a family of Faulkners stayed here. He was horseman. Then Mr. Glasgow, who stayed at Arness. His tractorman was Gordon Bremner and family. Then Mr. and Mrs. Tom McKellar and family, Barbara and Hamish. They still farm here today. We will get a closer shot at this later. Scotta Clys. Mr. and Mrs. Stewart with son Louis, who worked the horses. Louis married Cathy Ross of Cold Home and moved to Nether Branchell when John Mason, Sr., retired from there. Their son Sandy now farms both the Branchills. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. Donald Wilson and family, Donald, Elizabeth, Bill, Irene, Austin and Kenny. Then there was the estate. We're now looking over towards the Lennox Hill. The prisoner of war camp was beside those bales and the tree you see in the field. The camp was built to house the Italian and German prisoners of war. They were transported to farms around Morayshire to work. British soldiers looked after them. Sergeant Walker later married Ella Watt of the village. Sergeant Tommy Livingston married Agnes MacArthur, and Mary Mackenzie later married Heinz Job, a German prisoner. He was called Darkie for short. Mary and Darkie made their home in Dallas. Inside, the keeper's house for this part of the estate, Mr. and Mrs. James Gillan and son James. Then Mr. and Mrs. Angus McKinnon and daughters Rachel and Alice. Family, then Captain Watson, then James Adam from Sweet Hillicatavis, then the McKeevers from Edenvale, then Mr. and Mrs. David Shand and family, now the estate. The Ardagh Cotter House. Mr. and Mrs. Geordie Finlay and son Jimmy stayed here. Jimmy now stays in the village. My first car, its registration number was EMX 389. It was a Ford Beetle Tourer, 1936. I smashed it at the Ardagh gate into the stone dyke. Fell asleep coming home from a dance in the Canda. Hillock Headcroft. Mr. and Mrs. William Grigger, better known as Shotty, stayed here, and their son Jimmy. Then there was the Reed family. Then Mr. and Mrs. Alec Kemp. Now Mr. and Mrs. David Shand, who retired from the Ardagh to here. And in the pram at the door is Angus, the same name as the man who's taken this photograph. I think Davy has started again. Hillock Head Farm. Mrs. Ross and son Willie, her 2 grandchildren, Ted and Graham Ross, stayed here. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. Sandy Smith and son Bob, followed by Mr. and Mrs. Peter Allen and daughter Peggy and son Willie. Then Mr. and Mrs. Willie Stewart and family. Willie was a son of Tommy Stewart of Branchell, now the estate. Angus McKinnon retired to here and still stays here.
Okay.
The Cardin Mill, better known as the Wool Mills. My grandfather came here in 1889 and worked the mills. My uncle George followed him. My father worked here for a time. George's family were Doll, Maggie, Agnes, Douglas, Gilbert, Ruby and Millie. Douglas was the last person to work the mill. The machinery and the sawmill was driven by a water wheel via the mill lathe. The old manse, the Reverend William Martin and his wife, then the Reverend Macmillan, who was minister until both the Dallas churches were united. The first minister to the United Church was the Reverend William Fleming and family. Then the church was linked with Rafford, the Reverend John Corner, and now they are both linked with Forres, the Reverend Peter Robertson. The Meikle Cross, or the Market Cross, is supposed to be the centre of Morayshire. Geddes stayed here, then Mrs. Mackay and daughter Lily, then Mr. and Mrs. Grant Stewart. State Head Forester's house. First, Mr. and Mrs. William Duncan, better known as Gandhi, and family, Bessie, Billy and George, followed by Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Campbell. The present Forester is Mr. John Wilson. Ballathraggan, Mr. and Mrs. Alec McGilvery and son Alec, who drove the horses. They brought up 3 girls here, Elsie Lawson, Jessie Kennedy and Margaret McRae. Then the estate shepherd stayed here, Morris Kennedy, then Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Stewart. Then the estate farm servants, Mr. and Mrs. George Murdoch and Mr. and Mrs. Davy Edwards. Ness Falls. I used to come here with my mother, taking photographs of this to sell in our shop in the village. Ness cottages. My grandfather Campbell used to come here in the summertime over the Lone Road herding sheep. My mother was a child here. Farm. There were the Rennies here, then Mr. Glasgow, who was also a traveller for Stork Margarine. Next was Mr. and Mrs. Shaw, who had a lot of sheep. Next was Mr. and Mrs. James Ewan with son James, who is farmer here today. Jimmy Ewan had a white pony before he had a car, and he rode on horseback to the village. When going to Elgin, he took off the saddle and bridle